What's good, family? Thanks for coming back to your show and mine, Bobby Ramo's Bottom Line. I have a great guest today, a fantastic book that you need to get, Watergate's Forgotten Hero, Frank Wills, The Night Watchman, by my buddy Adam Henning. Adam, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Bobby.
I thoroughly enjoyed your book and past interviews with your other books, as people can see going through there. You had a great book, Baseball Under Siege, the Yankees, the Cardinals, and the Doctors battle to integrate spring training. And also, you had another book that you wrote, and I'm going to have you talk about that a little bit. You wrote a book that had a lot to do with Alex Haley, and we're going to talk about that during this interview. But this book here is a fantastic book. It's a far stretch from a sports story. I was so happy to see about somebody finally write about Frank Wills, because to me, he's been a forgotten man. What made you decide to write about Mr. Wills?
Well, you had mentioned Alex Haley earlier. That was my first book. And what was nice about Alex Haley is he gave me my topics for the next two books. He was a prolific journalist before he was the author of Roots, an autobiography of Malcolm X. He was a writer for Playboy magazine, Reader's Digest, a popular magazine called Sport, which was really the equivalent of Sports Illustrated of its day.
I have a box in my garage full of sport magazines. Yeah, I used to read that. Loved it.
Oh, yeah. It's a fantastic magazine that has clearly stood the test of time. So if you find back issues, I highly recommend reading them. But anyway, so one of the topics after Roots, Haley, of course, was the most popular author in the world. The movie came out, the book came out, all at the same time. It was another racial reckoning for the United States, and for that matter, for the world. Believe it or not, 40 years ago, slavery really was not taught in American schools. It was not discussed. There was no understanding, at least in the mainstream, about how African Americans really came to this country. It was not on their own free will. And Roots explained that, and Haley did that in his book. And so what that book focuses on is what happens afterwards. But while I was researching the book, I found that Haley had a hard time trying to find a follow-up topic. And one of the topics he considered was Frank Wills, who, of course, is the 24-year-old security guard who had detected the burglars at the Watergate office building in June of 1972, which, of course, within less than 2 years, eventually led to the resignation, the only time in U.S. history, of a U.S. president.
Right. And, when you mentioned about how little was being taught in those days about slavery and stuff, you could fast forward that to today with the whole CRT argument, critical race theory. They're trying to get rid of the same thing. Yeah, June 16th, 1972, ripped and gripped this nation. Then President Richard Nixon, he had his chief of staff, that guy, H.R. Haldeman, and Nixon said to him, I want them to just break in and take it out. Do you understand? Just go in and take it. Go in around 8 or 9 o'clock. Adam, explain to our audience exactly what the hell President Nixon was talking about at that time.
Nixon was, 5 years ago when I started this book, Obama was the president, and no one thought Trump would ever be in the White House. So it really seemed quite outlandish when I started this book. But now it doesn't seem like that, as I explained it. To be honest with you, it's like, oh, well, that just happens all the time, apparently.
Sure, exactly.
Because what Nixon did is essentially what Trump has done. But I would argue that Trump has done it tenfold. I mean, it pales in comparison. But in any event, Nixon was using the same tactics as Trump. But unlike Trump, Nixon had very high approval ratings. Not throughout his presidency, but as he got closer and closer to re-election, it was very clear once McGovern became the nominee for the Democrats, and McGovern was like, it was like nominating Bernie Sanders. I mean, he had no shot. And so Nixon was very paranoid. He had no friends. Everyone who he associated with, it was for
Again, he sounds a lot like Trump.
yeah. It was all political transaction.
No friends, afraid of his own shadow.
Yeah. Very just inadequate in so many ways,
Right.
and should never have been in that position of power, because ultimately, obviously, as we know, thanks to his recording devices, he was corrupt, and this was one of many ways that he was. And so what he did was he tapped his chief of staff, H.R. Alderman, to create essentially a re-election campaign committee, as we later learned is called CREEP. And basically, appropriately, they were also known as the plumbers. And so the plumbers would go around and try to dig up political dirt on the opposition, even though Nixon had this campaign in the bag. It just wasn't enough. And so he got very greedy, and they started burglarizing offices, anywhere where their Democrat headquarters were at work. And that was, of course, including the Watergate office building, which is where their lead office was. And so they would go in there, they would steal documents, they would take pictures. They would make it look like it was just a random burglary, and that they were trying to steal typewriters or things like that. But they were very sloppy. And one day, I think it was in May, so it was about a month before the actual Frank Wills detection, they went in there, they were not detected, and they took a bunch of pictures of material that they thought would be useful in trying to portray McGovern as, a socialist. I mean, it's all this. It's like I said, it's the cycles of history. It's the same thing.
And that was only a month before the other break-in. This was May 5th of 72.
That's correct.
Now, right?
Yeah. So at the time, the Attorney General was John Mitchell, and he had looked at the photographs of what the burglars had taken pictures of, and I forget the exact quote, but basically they were of no use to him. He's like, "You need to go back," right. And so they eventually go back, and that's when they get caught. And if you've ever seen the movie, it's a great scene. It's the opening scene.
All the President's Men, which we're going to talk about later.
Yeah. And these 5 men dressed in suits, wearing gloves, when they're caught, and I just go into detail in the book, so it's much better. But when they get caught, the police officers who actually arrest them think there's only one burglar, but they end up seeing 5 sets of hands. And so they knew that something was off. This is not a normal breaking and entering situation.
Yeah, at all. And let me go back to something you said that to me once again is very Trump-like. When you said Nixon, we found out what he was about with the tapes from his phone calls. Once again, like Trump, he was full of himself. He decided he wanted his phone lines tapped in the White House for posterity's sake. He thought that down the road, people were going to want to hear what he had to say. He was so pompous and so full of himself. And he's on these tapes saying the most negative things about people within this country. And he's the one who taped himself and forgot that it was being taped. I mean, you just can't write that script. And that reminds me a lot about Trump just doing just stupid stuff. Talk to me about how Nixon tried to recruit to conduct surveillance on the Democrats. He went straight to FBI boss J. Edgar Hoover, and I'm surprised Hoover declined. He was such a dirty dog. Why did he decline to get involved in that?
Well, Hoover was at that point on his final leg. He had been in the FBI for decades. He was there from the very beginning, and he served under many presidents, Eisenhower, Kennedy, LBJ, and of course Nixon. Nixon wanted him to do everything, and Hoover, for whatever reason, and I don't know enough about it, but he did draw the line. But once Hoover died, because that was the only way he was going to leave office, he was not going to politely retire. Once he resigned, Nixon installed someone that he was able to control.
Right.
The last name, I forget his first name, is Patrick Gray. And so basically, he was able to use Gray to tap into, literally, their political opponents.
Right. Now, let's get into Frank Wills a little bit. I mean, he was a quiet guy, North Augusta, South Carolina, very quiet, withdrawn kid, raised by his mother Marjorie. But he was just a regular, everyday, quiet, shy guy, correct?
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's just say it was someone that the people who knew him best were very surprised that he was in the position that he was when this happened. He was a high school dropout. He was only 24 years old. He had very little training, formal training. He was not exactly a former police officer. He had no law enforcement experience. He had no military experience.
He was a security guard
He was, yeah,
in
he
the
was
70s.
in the 70s for a private, for a private company. And at that time, the security industry was booming, because up until then, it was a relatively small industry. But as corporations grew and they wanted to protect their assets and their facilities, they started hiring private security. It was much cheaper than hiring off-duty police officers.
Right.
And they would offer them minimal training. Basically, if something happens, call 911, and that's exactly what he did. So he did everything he was supposed to do, except as I go into the details of that night, he does take a break for a couple hours to go have a burger and a milkshake, and literally closes down the
Brother
building.
got to eat. Brother
Yeah.
got to eat now. Shoot.
Well,
Let me add this as somebody who's a 27-year cop. I was impressed that even though he was a security guard without any training, he took his job seriously, because he was checking all the doors. I know a lot of cats, doing private duty, and they're there 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the morning. They're sitting there sleeping in a chair. They don't check doors. And as a former cop, I have to give him credit. He was doing his job. He was, as we say, making the rounds. He wasn't lazy. I think that's something that needs to be put out there.
hey, Bobby, I agree.
You were talking about all 5 of these guys,
Mhm.
Watergate burglars, and there were 2 accomplices, including ex-FBI agent G. Gordon Liddy and ex-CIA agent E. Howard Hunt. There were a lot of stories, because this was a month and a half before the election. And Washington Post reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein wrote an explosive article, said FBI finds Nixon's aides sabotage Democrats. Nixon, before we go on, still destroyed McGovern to win the presidency. He still destroyed, just rolled all over him. But the Watergate trials went on, and I found it interesting that when Frank Wills got his name called in the courtroom gave him a standing ovation. To a
Yeah.
security.
Well, yeah. So,
Okay, I'm just saying.
yeah, no, he became kind of this cultural icon.
Right.
There were popular musicians who had pins of Frank Wills' face attached, you know, uh, to their lapels. I mean, he kind of had a certain cachet, which was why he was able to monetize his fame for a couple of years, especially right after Nixon resigns. Um, but unfortunately, and this is really where I focus the book, is that those 15 minutes of fame eventually evaporate and the nation
Yeah.
moves on. But Wills couldn't. He didn't have the wherewithal to make his fame last. He didn't have the longevity. He was very resentful. He was very bitter, and he had certain justification for it, and that's what I
Right.
argue, despite the fact that he was also in the right place at the right time. He really got screwed over in the end.
Right. And he had hired that agent, Dorsey Levens, after there was one article in the black magazine Jet, which I still have some, and there were no endorsements coming in. But Dorsey had said, and I quote, if he was white, he'd be a hero and at the top of his profession, close quotes. To use that analogy, when you look at the sports, Mickey Mantle in comparison got a lot more ads, a lot more side business and commercials than what Willie Mays did. So there had to be some truth to what Dorsey Evans was talking about, that if he were white, he would have been a hero. That didn't happen for this guy at all.
Yeah, there's no question. There's absolutely no question. And that's why it was important not only to tell what happened to Wills afterwards, but it's also important to understand where Wills came from. He came from the deep South. He was born into segregation. His mother was a domestic, which is a fancy way of saying she was a maid. She always worked for white families. So he grew up under Jim Crow,
Mhm.
and in 1972 there were a lot of progress had been made. No, no, the Kerner Commission had come out, explained how in 1968, following the riots, that one of the reasons why that there's a huge gap between blacks and whites is the way that blacks are represented in the media, and that was just a drop in the bucket. I mean, there were so many, it was so systemic racism as it is still today. I mean, as much progress as we've made, there's still a lot more to go. But Wills, I think, personified what happens when you're black and you make the kind of discovery that he did, as opposed to someone who was white. Would he have been treated differently? Of course. Would he have gotten more endorsements? Yes. Would he have made more money off of it? No question. So yeah, I mean that's one of the things that I explain, and the Willie Mays Mickey Mantle comparison is such a great example, because the truth is I think Willie Mays was so much of a better ball player than
So
Mickey
did I. So did I.
Mantle. I mean, he just did so much more. He played so much longer, and yet it took him 10 times as much effort to make the kind of money that Mantle did. I mean, Mantle didn't have to do anything. People came
Yeah,
to him.
right,
Mays had to fetch every endorsement he could. So it's just another example of the disparities between blacks and whites.
right. You know, I talked earlier about G. Gordon Liddy and James McCord. These were FBI, CIA people. Now, they were found guilty for their roles in the break-in. And during the sentencing trial, they delivered a letter to the judge talking about the political pressure they were under from the White House to remain quiet. And Attorney General John Mitchell, um, General Counsel John Dean, they knew in advance about this break-in. My point is, can you imagine? It was easier to sweep things, even something that big. It was easier to sweep it under the bridge than it would be anywhere near like today. Imagine if that was going on today with social media,
Mhm.
what kind of uproar and information would be going nonstop, 24/7. They were lucky. They were lucky by their time frame.
Yeah, yeah, no, no, I agree. They were very unlucky that there were these two reporters who happened to be just in the perfect point in their career to do what they did. Of course, I'm talking
Right,
about Woodward and Bernstein.
right,
They were in their 20s, they were single, they had no children, they had no responsibilities, and they
right.
were both very hungry reporters, very ambitious, and they are should be credited as well, and they are obviously uh,
Sure.
for bringing down Nixon.
Uh, and yeah, he resigned August 8th of 1974.
Mhm.
But it still resonates to me that a lightly educated young black man who was a security guard spearheaded the resignation of the most powerful man in the world, Richard Nixon. Talking about the Watergate break-in and the movie All the President's Men, I think it was 75 or 76. Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman. were stars of this. It grossed over $70 million, which is like $325 million today, and earned an Oscar. The first 16 seconds of the film, the only black person in the movie, I felt like I was watching an episode of Friends. The only black person in the movie, 15 seconds, happened to be Frank Wills himself, the one who did all this. And the brother was paid a whopping $1,500 for his close-up appearance. Small potatoes for the man who did all this. The movie grossed all $325 million today. He got $1,500. That's sad to me. And yeah, we're gonna get into in a little while how bitter he was. But I'd have been a lot ticked off myself.
Yeah, it says a lot, not only about the movie, but in the entire scandal. I mean, whether you were a Republican or a Democrat, he was the only African American, the only non-white person involved. I mean, so what does that say at that time is that if you were in political power, you were essentially a white male. There was no room for anyone else. And Wills was only there, I mean, by accident, because he was, again, in the right place at the right time, and because he did his job correctly, as you stated earlier. And the sad part is that $1,500 was the most he was ever paid for a single appearance.
Great point, yeah.
For his Watergate heroics. That was the most money. Dorsey Evans was very pleased that he was able to make that happen. And Wills, even though it was only 15 seconds on film, he was part of 3 weeks of filming. So, it wasn't like he just showed up and then left. I mean, it was like yeah. In fact, in the original cut, so before they got it down to the original to the final, 2+ hours that it became, it was like a 3-minute scene. It was much longer than it should have been, but again, they had to cut it, and he got, as Dorsey Evans put it, if you blink, you'll miss his appearance.
Yeah, and if he had blinked and walked by that door, anyway, he did an interview with CBS Nightly News and then later Jet Magazine, where he rightly said that the burglars, they got more recognition for what they did than he did. Guys like John Dean and Howard Hunt, he said they can write books. All of these crooks can write books. The publicity that he got was basically nothing. And he hit that right in the head. He hit that right on the head, that these criminals went on to be stars and writing books and on all these TV shows. And he wasn't treated like a hero at all, Frank Wills. And he really was, but he wasn't treated like anywhere near being a hero. It's just sad.
Yeah. I mean, it was I found it strange that all of the appearances that he was paid to be at, they were almost always a black church or some sort of African-American focused organization or university. It was like, because he was black, he was not accessible to 90% of the rest of the public. If you wanted to go see him, you had to go through this black circuit. And again, because of the lack of economic resources, he wasn't able to capitalize it, as you described, with all the people, like Liddy, Hunt, Woodward, and Bernstein, all of them. They made a lot of money.
Yeah, memorabilia from these guys.
Yeah,
these are the gloves I wore when I broke in.
Yeah. I mean, so look, Gordon Liddy, I mean, he became a movie star, he was Miami Vice, and Wills couldn't get anything. He can get no work. All he was, I mean, it's really,
Altman got out and became a real estate developer, big time, millionaire behind that stuff. These guys used this negative ripping off the country, this crime, to just increase their financial status. It's just sad. I mean, you got a guy like Frank Wills who did the right thing at the right time. He's painting in his neighborhood. He's going door to door, looking to cut people's grass. He was trying to survive. It's a great book. it's a great book that people need to read because it's a compelling story of not just what happened, but also the history of this country. And like you said in the book, there's just so many. And folks, as you can see, when I read stuff, I tab. You see how many tabs are in here. Okay, it's just that fantastic of a book that Adam did. He only appeared in one magazine, and that was the issue of Jet in May 17th of 73. He had gotten close with that guy. I want to talk a little bit about his relationship that you talked about with the author, Simeon Booker, and talk about what Simeon was trying to do for him. He went on the game show to tell the truth, and some country singer wrote a song about him. I'm surprised Dylan didn't. Maybe he did. I just don't know it. But it was just talk about this guy, Simeon Booker, and some more about what Wills was going through.
Well, if there are any authors out there, Booker deserves a biography too. He was a real trailblazer. He's a journalist, and he actually started with the Washington Post, and he covered the civil rights movement.
Okay.
He was on the front lines during the Emmett Till murder. That was back in the mid 1950s, and so by the time he meets Wills, he too is a bit disgruntled. He found that there was a ceiling at the
Wouldn't
Post.
you be? Wouldn't you be?
Yeah. If Booker were around today, he'd be writing for the New York Times.
Right.
And by the way, he just died. He was 99 years old.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, talk
That's
about
just so okay.
yeah. I mean, his life really is a snapshot of American history. He lived through so many eras, and he was, as I mentioned, he was a trailblazing journalist. But by the 1970s, he's working for Jet, and he's freelancing as well. And him and Wills, they got along very well. I think in some ways they had kind of a father-son relationship.
Yeah.
He really tried to help Frank as much as possible. He saw that he didn't have the resources, the support system needed to get through this, and so he always tried to get Wills the spotlight whenever he could, so he could receive donations, and so just people wouldn't forget about him. But they I was able to speak with Booker's widow. She shared some letters, and they were very close. And anyway, so Booker would basically chronicle the final 25 plus years of Wills's life following the break-in up until his death in 2000. And so whenever there was an anniversary of Watergate, and we still do this every 5 years, it seems, Wills would be in the media. And it wouldn't just be the black press, it would also be the mainstream media. And it was basically like, what happened? And so Booker would do this as well. And there was usually a photograph that accompanied them at the 10-year anniversary. So this was in 1982. The two of them walked from the Watergate office building to the White House. And along the way, they encounter this black homeless veteran. And he figures out that, oh, this is Frank Wills. Oh, you got screwed too.
Wow.
So,
Okay.
it was a really interesting.
And you look just like me.
Yeah. It was very clear. Yeah. It was a very poignant moment. But yeah, Booker, and so to be honest with you, without Booker's writings, I don't know if there would have been enough to write a book. I mean, he did so much to provide chronology and insight and information that it really was perhaps the most important single resource in writing this book.
Well, bless Mr. Booker. So talk about also my buddy, Congressman Charlie Rangel, how he even tried to help Frank Wills get some proper recognition. Speak to that a little bit.
Well, we think of Rangel, or at least I do, as kind of the elder black statesman of Congress. But in 1972, he was a young guy.
Right, he was a first-time congressman, right?
Yeah, he's from Harlem. He was fiery.
He won 23 times in a row. Yeah.
But Rangel was one of the only congressmen during the hearings, because he was on the subcommittee that was investigating, and this was in the House, investigating the Watergate burglary. He's saying, we need to recognize that this was brought upon because of a black night watchman. Um, and and there were a couple other members of Congress who also acknowledged Frank Wills in the official record.
Talk
Um,
about Ron Dellums is one I was going to ask you about. He tried to
Ron,
get him into college.
yeah. Ron Dellums, who also recently passed away, he represented Oakland, California, which is near where I grew up. Dellums, again, another at the time young congressman. He was fresh out of the military. He had served in Vietnam. Um, and again, Dellums too, he tried to offer his office's support to help Will. So this is where I think I've met readers who have told me, I definitely feel bad for Wills, but I do think he passed up some opportunities where he could have maybe not capitalized on being the Watergate hero, but at least have a career. Whether it's in law enforcement or in private security. And I think there is some truth to that because he did get some offers, but he was never able to follow through. And so much of that wasn't because Wills was lazy. He just didn't have anyone to help guide him. I mean, if the closest person is a reporter from Jet Magazine, that doesn't say much, about his support system. He was very close with his mom, but she was not educated. She didn't understand or comprehend kind of fully what the magnitude of this was. She was very protective of her son, but she didn't have the means to provide him,
For the
as
world.
yeah, yeah.
For the world, for the white world.
He didn't have any siblings.
Right,
He didn't know who his father was. He did have a lot of extended family who helped protect him, but again, he lacks support.
right.
And
And I
yeah,
think that ties in with us early talking about how shy and withdrawn he was. He was a mama's boy. Um, all of that kind of lends in reading this great book. It gave me an impression quite that the intestinal fortitude wasn't there because to fight for yourself isn't always an easy thing to do when you're fighting, especially against the U.S. government and the country as well. Folks, you're listening to your show and mine, Bobby Rainbow's Bottom Line, here with Adam Henning, author of the great book Watergate's Forgotten Hero, Frank Wills, Night Watchman. Um, Another time on page 110, you wrote about when he once again gave an interview to Jet Magazines and Simeon Booker. He wrote something that I thought was real poignant, and I'm going to read. I want to get it right, and I quote: "Look at how comfortable President Nixon and most of all these men live today.
mhm.
It seems that the bad guys got a good deal, and a good guy got the bad deal." Close quote. He told the New York Times, quote, "John Dean can write a book. Howard Hunt can write a book. All these crooks can write a book. The publicity they received is out of proportion with what I got. I got truth and honesty, and they got the money." Close quote. The truth hurts sometimes. The truth hurts sometimes, but that's exactly where he was. Here's a question for you, Adam. Do you think the way that Frank Wills handled this Watergate situation, do you think it was a great thing for him, or was it an albatross around his neck?
Well, I try to let the reader make that decision.
Oh, okay, but I got your ass right now.
Yeah,
What do you
I
think?
I really think, midway through the book, really as his fame starts to deplete, I do kind of an economic analysis. How much would he have earned if he had just maintained his position as a up and coming private security guard? Based on just consistent wages. Because what he ended up doing was quit his job so he could try to monetize his fame, and that didn't work out. But if he had just stayed on that track, on this expanding industry, which didn't require a high school degree, let alone a college degree, he seemed like he probably could have etched out a career, and that would have afforded him possibly stability, financial stability, which would in turn maybe make him more desirable to be a husband, to start his own family. um, to let his mom uh, retire, so she doesn't have to work until her old age. Um, so the truth is, for him personally, it would have been better if he hadn't been in this situation. But for the country, it would have been much worse because Watergate would be nothing more today than just the name of a 1960s Art Deco uh, apartment, hotel, office building complex.
I gotta say this: it wouldn't even be that because we wouldn't even have known about it.
Yeah, yeah. If you
If
lived
he
outside the
didn't do his
Beltway,
job to the extent he did, there would have been no Watergate.
and that's my point.
All
Exactly.
right.
So for him personally, it's a tremendous sacrifice. That's why he deserved, in my view, a
He's a true patriot.
yeah.
He's what you would call a true patriot, not these cats, going into the White House and crashing and breaking windows
Oh,
and doing all. They're not patriots like they always say. A cat like Frank Wills was a true patriot.
yeah, but and so he sacrificed his life so we could reveal how dark democracy can be, and of course we're seeing that today. Um, as we
Especially to a dark man. I gotta throw that in there. Especially to a dark man.
yeah,
It's,
yeah.
um, as I was saying, he was going around the neighborhood mowing lawns and selling perfume door to door. And was a nursing attendant for the elderly for a while. You were talking about that on page 114. Not
Mhm.
quite what you would call a Watergate hero. His life had gotten so difficult, and I want to get into this a little bit. He got arrested for some um, petty theft issues. Law enforcement was trying to lock him up for years. To me, I know that most cops are Republicans, number one. Um, to me, that had a lot to do about how the Republicans viewed him in those days and the disdain that they had for him for bringing this whole thing to light. What do you think about that? Because they were trying to put him away for years for some petty stuff.
So when Frank returned from DC back home to South Carolina, he grew up in a county that overwhelmingly supported Nixon. He grew up in a state that overwhelmingly supported Nixon, and so did the state across the bridge, Georgia. So he didn't exactly have a hero's welcome home, and he was shunned. So it was very difficult for him to get a job, very difficult to make a living, and he had already had that I'm aware of one run-in with law enforcement a few years earlier for stealing a 95-cent ballpoint pen from a grocery store. And he was cited for it. So when he was caught stealing a pair of tennis shoes that at the time I think was less than $20 in value, they used that theft of a ballpoint pen um, as an opportunity as his second offense. And so that's why he wasn't cited for the stealing of the shoes, but that he was actually sentenced, and ended up being a year in jail. I mean, it was so absurd. And the rationale from the judge was ridiculous. And there was justifiably so tremendous national outcry. Um, Unfortunately, it was very embarrassing for Wills because it seemed like the only time he was ever in the news after Watergate was for something bad, something negative. And this, of course, was a great example of that. And so his trial went all the way up to the Supreme Court. But the Supreme
Over,
Court, of course,
over some tennis shoes.
over some tennis shoes, yeah. But of
Okay,
course,
I'm just saying. Yeah,
it wasn't about the tennis shoes.
right.
It
A
was
pen. I'm
obviously.
sorry. A bigger thing was the pen. Right. Right.
Yeah, yeah, and he fortunately had a very good attorney who ended up becoming a judge in Georgia who represented him because the crime took place in Augusta, which was only 5 minutes away from where he grew up in North
Former
Augusta.
James Brown, Augusta, GA.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, so Wills gets arrested and he ends up spending a few weeks in jail, and eventually they just let him go. I think it had to do with overcrowding. I mean, it was ridiculous. It was all a waste of time, waste of money, and it clearly had some racial connotations. And yes, he was not a. I mean, I'm sure law enforcement was not a fan of his. So I'm sure that
Oh,
played a role.
page 133 and 134, you were talking about another guy that I knew, the great comedian activist Dick Gregory in '84. He reached out to Frank Wills trying to help him, offered him a $50,000 a year job and to co-author a cookbook. And they had some kind of falling out. And Dick Gregory gave him a one-way ticket back to Washington. Did you ever find out what that falling out was about?
Well, according to Frank, it was about money. Gregory was having some tax issues. He owed back taxes to the IRS, and my hunch is he wasn't able to pay all of his bills. One of them being to his employee Frank Wills. Of course, Gregory denied it later on, and even bragged about how much he paid Frank. But according to Frank, he wasn't getting paid, and so Frank just essentially quit and left. Um, Again, another, Frank, he was very gullible, and any opportunity that came his way, he took it. And the truth is, he didn't have many others, so he really didn't have any, options.
Right.
But he was hired because of his name and because of the publicity. I mean, that was the whole gimmick. He had no background in selling health supplements, which is what Gregory's business was about.
Right. Yeah, I used to get that drink. I forgot that it was in a tan container. I can't remember the name of it right now, but yeah, I used to get that drink. Um, by the time Wills's mother Marjorie suffered a stroke in Bohemian Diet, it just came to me. Bohemian Diet.
Mhm.
That was Dick Gregory's drink. And also, I wanted to put something out here on page 122. You had said the sneakers were worth $12, not even 20, $12 sneakers. But by the time his mother Marjorie suffered a stroke in 1990, he had been taking care of her. They were there. He's really struggling because the food stamps are discontinued. He was denied for Social Security disability benefits, and he and his mother have been living on $450 Social Security income. He was going through, like we would know today, we call mental depression. He was going through a lot of moodiness and mental health issues when she passed, and she left him the small house. But he, according to your book, everything that as you're reading up, he seemed like he had mentally left this world already. Um, when he passed away, September 27, 2000, it was reported that he passed away from a brain tumor. But you said it really wasn't the actual cause of his death. What he had hidden, that he had something that he hid from family, friends, and neighbors. Um, that he had complications with AIDS.
Mhm.
Did you ever find out where that came from?
Well, it's funny. This is the fun part of being a biographer. And I say fun, like maybe that's not the right word as we're talking about the cause of his death. But
Right,
what I meant is that when you're doing research about someone's life, you're going to come across a lot of documents, and the more research you do, the more documents
more
you.
you're gonna find, right? Yeah,
Yeah, and I happened to just be double checking something. So I had already actually written most of the book at this point, and I was double checking his death certificate to make sure that I got it right, the cause of death. Because
right.
I explained, get into a little bit more detail about the brain tumor, and I noticed in the nurses, or I should say, in the doctor's handwriting about what the complication was. That's when I saw those four letters,
Mm,
complicated AIDS. And all of a sudden, I just was shocked. How did I miss this? I had probably looked at this document a half a dozen times. And this was from the medical examiner's report. This was an official government document. That's how I was able to get it. Um, but he died from AIDS. And then I received confirmation from his former girlfriend, um, because it had never been reported before. The party line was that he died from a brain tumor, but it wasn't that. It was because of AIDS. And then I started to do research about, we associate AIDS exclusively with gay men, you know,
mm,
and it is true that during the 1980s, that
Yeah.
disease plagued that particular demographic group. But by
Even
the
later with Magic Johnson. Even later.
yeah, that plays up to it. So by the early 90s, there's another demographic group that is getting hit hard with AIDS, and it's being underreported. And of course, it's the African American community. Um, because of a lack of funding, because of a lack of access to proper health care, particularly in places like the South or in the inner city, AIDS is running rampant. And Wills, who was not gay and was not a drug user, that again that I'm aware of, and never came across any evidence to believe otherwise. He was having unprotected sex, and he contracted it, and he was very quiet about it. They One of the very few pieces of evidence that he acknowledged, doesn't even acknowledge that he has it, but it seems strange. He's writing to a gay magazine called The Advocate. Um, and he's talking about how he discovered some sort of potion to cure AIDS. Why would a black uh, heterosexual male be writing to a gay magazine about discovering a remedy for AIDS? I mean, why else would you do it unless, of course, you had the disease, which he did. Um, and he most likely received treatment in Augusta. There was a Ryan White AIDS ward. Ryan White, of course, was the white youth from Indiana who had contracted AIDS through a blood transfusion. That was when they started to realize, the medical community, that you can contract AIDS through a variety of sources, one of which is, of course, having blood transfusions. Um, but so he was getting treatment there, but he was very quiet about it, and no one really knew until the final weeks of his life, when he was in the hospital and he was dying, and that's when his family was aware that he had had AIDS. But otherwise, it was kept very quietly. I don't know if his mother knew, and I don't know if he even knew at that time before she died, because again, he died in 2000. Um, he may have contracted it afterwards. He may have contracted it before, but he could have lived with it for 10 or even 15 years. We just don't know. Again, lack of medical access. He didn't have sufficient health care, and so when you put that all together, you don't have health education, uh, access to medicine. Um, these types of diseases are going to disproportionately impact poor, disenfranchised communities. And guess what? We're seeing that right now with COVID-19, how it's disproportionately impact people of color.
Well, as the saying goes, when white America has the sniffles, black America has the flu. That's just the way that works. I didn't know that he had a girlfriend. So maybe he was writing to them trying to, for once in his life, get paid. Because if he's doing lawn work and riding a bike, he didn't have a car, he's riding a bike. You got a girlfriend, you're gonna need a couple of ducats. You're gonna need a couple of ducats. Maybe he was trying to get paid. I don't know. But one other, before we end, he was working on an autobiography. Did that get lost upon his death? Because it wasn't finished. So did that ever turn up anywhere, or is it lost?
I looked for that thing on
I'm
eBay.
sure you did. I'm sure you did.
I asked every person who knew him, are you familiar with this? It would have been a gold mine. And unfortunately, so when he died, his home went into foreclosure, and it was eventually razed. In bunches, it was in there, and all of his belongings were removed. So it was among them, and it was never found.
Right. Adam, you're a fantastic writer. And the last paragraph I want to read because I thought it was the most powerful words in your book. You stated, and I quote, Frank Wills couldn't lead a normal life. He lived in the shadow of Watergate, plagued by massive regrets over the action he had taken on the morning of June 17, 1972. For the remainder of his life, he missed no opportunity to express his bitterness and disappointment. Yet, this should not distract us from the indisputable fact that Frank Wills was an American hero. He deserves to be remembered. Close quote. That was a great ending to your book. Last question to you. If Frank Wills was not involved in Watergate, do you think he leads a healthier, longer life?
I do. I do. And like I said, I really think he would have been um, he would have been happier, and it just would have been more stable. He has a cousin who's still around, who was born on his birthday, same year, same date. And he leads a very relatively normal, I mean, he leads a normal life. You know, he's got kids, he's got grandkids, he owns his own home. He's still, you know, he lives in South Carolina. I mean, I just think that Frank wasn't seeking fame at any
Yeah,
point in his life until after, of course, Watergate. And the only reason why he was seeking it is he needed to pay the bills. You know, he
right.
needed to earn some sort of income.
And he saw all these criminals making millions.
Yeah, and and you talked about it earlier. If you would be bitter too, so would I, and so would
Yeah,
anyone, because it's a double standard. And again, and that's what drew me to the book. Was it wasn't just about the life of Frank Wills. This was an example of how there's two Americas.
yeah, yeah. Family, this is a fantastic, important book, Watergate's Forgotten Hero, Frank Wills, Night Watchman, authored by my buddy you've been listening to, Adam Henning. Adam, congratulations on this book, and it was such a necessary book. I hope that you enjoyed your time on your show and mine, Bobby Ramos' Bottom Line. And I wanted to add, I'm also looking forward to your next book on one of my favorites growing up, Ron LaFleur of the Detroit Tigers. He's an interesting story, but it's going to be written by an interesting man. So I'm looking forward to it, Adam. Thank you very much for today.
Oh, thanks for having me, Bobby. Anytime.
Family, thanks for always enjoying your show and mine, Bobby Ramos' Bottom Line. I don't want to be a man of power, but I do want to be a man of purpose. Thank you for your time, this time. Until next time.